I want to really thank the Buffett Institute. You know, this was just a project that I started. I never knew how much it was going to grow when I first conceived of the Center for Forced Migration Studies. In fact, it was just an asylum advocacy project. And I have a lot of people to thank in doing that. I won't thank them all tonight. But I do want to mention, especially from the Buffett Center, Bruce Carruthers, who is here. He's the director of the Buffett Center. Where is Bruce? Where did he go? He's over there. Thank you, Bruce. And I want to give a special thanks to Brian Hansen. Brian Hansen is the director of research and programs at the Buffett Institute. Stand up a moment, Brian. Brian has been not just a mentor and a friend, but really a source of inspiration. Whenever I have a question or anything, you know, I need, even in designing this whole program, you know, and putting this event here tonight, it's what should I do, Brian? So thank you very much, Brian, for being there. Many of you are here tonight for different kinds of advertising that we sent out, and you're all here because you're very interested in what's going on right now in the world today about refugees and what our country is going to be doing about Syrian refugees and refugee resettlement. When we put out our flyer, you know, everyone says you have to have a visual, so we're very careful. We want to put photos that kind of are representative of the kind of thinking that we do at the Center for Forced Migration Studies. So I don't know, how many of you saw the flyer in coming here with the photos? So those photos actually are refugees along the resettlement process. And so it was sort of trying to, you know, get yourself mixed into thinking, well, what is a resettled refugee? So they're not all in the United States. But the final photo is from here in Chicago. And it's from the Global Garden Training Farm. And Linda Saylor is here tonight. Linda, where are you? So she founded the Global Garden Training Farm where different refugees, Burmese, mostly Burmese, Nepalese, different, get together and do farming in the city of Chicago. And there's flyers actually out by our, on our front table when you first entered the check-in table where you could read more about her program. But that's really representative of the kind of partnerships that we do at the CFMS. We like to work with local partners, we like to work with NGOs, policymakers, a wide range of people, and we like to do a lot of listening. So I want to say thank you to all our partners in being there. You also would have seen on the video monitors outside, and as you walked in, that's a video exhibit, Sanctuary and Sustenance, that's put together by another one of my friends and partners, Leslie Thomas from the Artwork Projects, and Maren Wickwire. Is Maren here? Actually, Maren was good. And Maren is here too, and there's literature more about the Artworks projects, the kind of work they do, and I hope you do take a moment to view Sanctuary and Sustenance on the video monitors during the reception. And I would also encourage you to view the Google Cardboard. Google Cardboard is a new technology that lets you see things in three-dimensional format. What we have, and it's been used right away to be able to bring you inside a Jordanian refugee camp. Sils of Sidra is an amazing way, although you're not, if you haven't visited a refugee camp, it's a way that you can at least experience a little bit of what that's like. And New York Times just came out with another segment on displacement, and so that, again, is for your viewing. We have phenomenal student interns CFMS interns who will help you in that viewing experience. I want to also extend my own special thanks to Erin Adelheit, without whom this event and our new research program on refugee resettlement would not have been possible. I met Erin a little over a year ago now, and he's, in business, an entrepreneur, but he and his wife Valerie have spent many hours volunteering with refugee girls at a very innovative school in Atlanta, and I had a chance to visit that with him when I went down to Atlanta to meet him last November. And this school takes girls who are in junior high and works closely with them through educators and volunteers like Erin and Valerie to prepare them for high school, and it's been very successful. But as Erin told me, what really got to him and got him involved in this is Valerie, his wife, came home one day after spending time working with a girl. And this girl's family was originally from Somalia, and she had spent her whole life in a refugee camp. She was in high school at that time, so her young life. And Valerie was reading a book to the girl who didn't even know how to turn a page. So the girl kept grabbing at the book, at the pages, like you grab an object. And Erin said to me, we have a new baby daughter. She's under a year old, but she knows how to turn pages better than this girl. Valerie really had to teach her book handling, She had never read a book before. She had never seen a book before. And that's really what drove him to contact the Buffett Center and the Center for Forced Migration Studies and then meet with me. And we spent a lot of time together. And Aaron really felt that, although the United States is a leader in terms of resettling more refugees than any other country in the world, we don't really do a good job harnessing the potential of refugees in terms of their economic and social contributions. Fortunately, Aaron agreed that the work we wanted to do here at Buffett, at the Center for Forced Migration Studies, to research the integration outcomes and long-term impacts of resettlement was necessary if we want to strengthen resettlement as a durable solution for the world's 16 million refugees, and that number seems to be growing, not going away. It might come as a surprise to many of you, but this is a very under-researched area. We have almost no studies on the long-term impacts of refugee resettlement, the integration outcomes. So that's the kind of work we are going to be doing here today. Since September, when the White House announced that we would be admitting 10,000 Syrian refugees, and now with the Paris attacks, of course, the national emphasis has taken a number of turns, right? First welcoming, now fearful. And I was kind of worried because I've been planning this event, since last November. I was worried there would be 3 of us sitting in the room talking about refugees, and it's turned into quite the national event. But as I was reminded, and I spoke with Aaron, just a few days ago, the news may change, but the work that needs to be done remains the same. In order for resettlement to be a strong global policy, we need research. We need research of its impact, successes, and outcomes for refugees. And the only way to offset the conjectures, rumors, and distortions that we now see in circulation is through research. You need data, deep qualitative studies, and this is the work that we're planning on doing through this at this research, the Resettlement Research Program. I think this is going to be even more crucial in coming years, and we hope to have your support in building our program. Senator Durbin actually was almost going to be here tonight, but he sent a letter. Senator Durbin, as many of you know, is very supportive of refugee resettlement in our country. So I just want to read you a couple of paragraphs from the letter. He just said, "Dear friends, I would like to congratulate the Buffett Institute for Global Studies at Northwestern University for the launch of an important and timely research program on refugee resettlement. The program should provide critical new information for policymakers, business leaders, and the public on best practices for refugee integration into our communities and the long-term benefits of refugee settlement policies." So it's other, but I'll leave it at that. So I want to tell you that earlier today, as Jay mentioned, 54, many people are sitting in the room, most of us, met from 8:30 this morning until 5 p.m. I kept a strong arm making everybody sit all day, talking. These were academics, policymakers, people in government, state refugee coordinators, all who are very concerned about how we could do better research. We're going to be coming out with a report and different outputs from that we'll be able to share, and hopefully you'll be reading some of that in the weeks to come. And it's really about research, policy recommendations, education, and public outreach. And in bringing you this program here tonight, that's what we're doing. We hope to be a place where you can find information and the place for, really setting the national conversation on a more productive path, a path that values our country as a nation of immigrants and a haven for the world's most vulnerable. Moderating our panel tonight, we have our very own Jerome McDonnell, who many of you know. For those of you who are not from Chicago, which are basically our visitors here for our daytime forum, Jerome is the host of our NPR affiliate WBEZ's program WorldView. I have been on his show a couple of times and was very, very happy that he agreed to moderate our panel, this conversation this evening. Jerome just has a wonderful knack for providing global affairs coverage of world issues with in-depth conversations on international issues and really getting at the local impact that has earned him a Peter Lissiger Award and an award by the Illinois Broadcasters Association for Best Public Affairs Program in a Series. Before handing the program over to him, I would like to just briefly introduce each of our panelists. We're very fortunate to have each of them here with us this evening. I'm not going to go in order because they sat out of order and in any order they wanted to. So we have Aleinikoff. Alex, That's him. Alex just completed 5 years of service as the UN Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees in Geneva, Switzerland. Before serving in that position, he had a long career working on immigration and refugee policy with the INS during the Clinton administration and as a co-chair of the immigration team for the Obama presidential transition. Alex is well known for his numerous books and articles, including one I use, which is a legal case book on forced migration law and policy. Prior to serving at the UN, he was the dean of the Law Center at Georgetown University, and he's now drawing upon his vast expertise and insight into the challenges of refugee protection as a visiting professor at the Global Policy Initiative at Columbia Law School. We also have with us here tonight Bob Carey, the other male who's not Jerome. Bob was with us here at Northwestern at the first CFMS conference back in January 2011. At that time, he was Vice President of Resettlement at the International Rescue Committee. At IRC, Bob oversaw the Resettlement and Overseas Screening Program for refugees for 10 years. So he has just a little bit of experience. We're happy to welcome you back to campus, Bob, but this time he comes as Director of the Office of Refugee Resettlement at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Administration and Families, or for those of us who can't say that whole thing, simply ORR. We have with us here also Ngoan Lee. Ngoan is our very own Illinois Refugee State Coordinator and Chief of the Bureau of Refugee and Immigrant Services at the Illinois Department of Human Services. She's a refugee herself from Vietnam and was resettled to the United States in 1975 and later became the first executive director of the Vietnamese Association of Illinois. She has had a strong impact on our state and Chicago as a model global city for refugee resettlement through her years of service to our state as a special assistant to Mayor Daley, chief program officer for the Chicago Department of Human Services, as an assistant to the Secretary for Special Projects, and as a special assistant to former Governor James Thompson for Asian American Affairs. And we have Suzanne Akhras Sahloul. So although Suzanne and I had been emailing back and forth for months trying to schedule a meeting about convening this evening, the news of the past few weeks brought us together numerous times. We've now become very much best friends, as she has worked around the clock to raise awareness of the plight of Syrian refugees who've been resettled in the U.S. and here in Illinois. As the founder of the Syrian American Medical Society Midwest Foundation, she represented the Syrian American community at the U.S. State Department's Global Diaspora Forum and was the Council of Islamic Organizations of Greater Chicago volunteer director. With the start of the crisis in Syria, though, Suzanne founded the Syrian Community Network. It's a nonprofit that helps support the transition and relocation of Syrian refugees after their arrival in Chicago by connecting them with services and support networks. And with that, take it away, Jerome.
Thanks for assembling such a great panel for me. You'd make a wonderful radio producer if you ever want a second job. The way we're going to do it is kind of go from the UN level and kind of walk through refugee resettlement to the federal level, to the state level, but we're going to jump around a little bit and let people jump in on each other. And we're going to start with the human face of it, with the Syrian Community Network, and talk about what they've seen so far. And I've gotten to know the Syrian American community pretty well. Whenever there's a world crisis, I get to know the folks in the Syrian American community pretty well in this case. And I've known Suzanne and her husband for several years now. And all the people in the Syrian American community have been exemplary. They've been involved in policy and advocacy, and they've been doing everything they can with their pocketbooks to find a solution for their home country and their loved ones back home. And her husband is a physician, and he was just recently in Greece. I had him on the show earlier this week, and he was helping refugees who are coming to Greece and providing medical care for them. And so I've known Suzanne a little bit a while, and I really admire everything she's done so far and is continuing to do here. Can you explain a little about the Syrian Community Network, why you started this, what you expected when you started it?
Thank you, Jerome. Hi, everyone. Good evening. It's great to be with all of you, and it was great to spend the whole day here at Northwestern University and to spend the day with everyone and learning from everyone. Well, we started the Syrian Community Network in 2015, but really before that, I was involved. I want to backtrack a little bit about my story because Galia mentioned the SAMS Foundation. And back in 2004, one of the first initiatives that I got into was starting the, SAMS had already been established, but then SAMS didn't have a charitable arm to it. So we founded the foundation, and my very first fundraiser in 2004 was $4,000, and I thought it was great, and everybody was laughing at me and told me to go home. So but I decided that I'm not going home, and that I'm going to continue my work with SAMS. And luckily today it has a budget of $24 million. So I'm really proud of that. So it's, in 2013, thank you. In 2013, SAM's national board had charged me with becoming the resettlement coordinator, refugee resettlement coordinator, to understand what it means to become a refugee, or how do refugees come to the United States, what are the processes, who are the major organizations, and how do people come here, and what type of support do people get, and what is it that makes a refugee a success story. So in 2013, my very first meeting was with Dr. Ed Silverman, the previous State of Illinois refugee coordinator, and he's like a wonderful mentor. And he gave me all of these, all of the advice, and told me to meet with this person and that person. He even connected me to the UNHCR, and I started going to conferences. And so really that initiative, that pushed me to form a group, a refugee group. And we decided to call it the Syrian Community Network. And with the start in this year, in January, when the first family came into Chicago, they came in through Refugee One. And Refugee One facilitated a meeting between us and the family, and we went there, and we immediately started to get to know the family more. And then we realized that community support is what makes a difference in the refugee success story.
How many people did you expect to see when you started doing this? Because there's only 2,000 Syrian American refugees in the country, but you were expecting a pretty good lump of them.
Yes. Well, early on, I mean, the United States has a tradition, of course, of resettling refugees, and Illinois also has a rich tradition of resettling refugees. So we thought the numbers would be much larger, and the process would be much faster. So we're a little bit surprised to see that the process is so slow. And I mean, everybody keeps talking about the vetting process, and and all of these hurdles that Syrian refugees have to go through. But we're happy now that we have 21 families in Chicago itself, and a lot of the families are so grateful to be here, and the continuing theme that we hear from the families is that we feel safe. This is like the most important aspect of their life, that we feel safe, that we can take our children to school, that people smile to us. This is what Fatima, one of the refugees, she met with Senator Durbin, and I know Cynthia is here from Senator Durbin's office, and and this is what she expressed to him: I feel safe. People smile at me. People smile to my children, and we can never underestimate the power of a smile and the power of being a welcoming community to these refugees.
And are they mostly women and children?
Yes, the majority are women and children, and young families. Really, all of the children are in grade school. We have one who's in high school, and then we have one who's 18, but she just got married actually to an Iraqi refugee. So, these things happen. I guess love happens, and it's a good thing. And there's also a young man who is 18 or 19 years old, her older brother, and he's right now the sole breadwinner for that family. So he has a lot of responsibility on his shoulders. But all of the families are eager to work and happy to be here, and say over and over that how they feel safe. My colleague Hadia is also here, and she works very closely with the families, and this is a continuing theme of feeling safe, feeling welcome is so important for them.
What's been the reaction to the news recently? Because there's people talking about, well, we want to ship people back. We don't even want to suspend the refugees coming in. We want to ship them back.
Yeah, it's very hurtful. They feel sad that this is being said about them. When one refugee said, "Well, no one called us to meet with us, and at least get to know us before you make these decisions or make these statements. Come and sit with us and have coffee and have tea, just like Senator Durbin did. He sat with us and he talked to us, and as a result, he's very supportive of refugee resettlement. Representative Jan Schakowsky also met with some of the refugees a couple of weeks ago with MoveOn.org. We facilitated a dinner with them. So when the representatives and our congressmen and our leaders meet with the families, they immediately welcome them, and they enjoy sitting with them and enjoy hearing their stories. So we really would encourage everyone who's saying no, we don't want refugees to come and meet with the refugees and have some tea, and they would receive them in their home and would be very happy to give them a taste of Syrian hospitality.
Yay.
So.
Let's go on and to kind of try to begin our refugee resettlement journey here, and start with Alexander Aleinikoff from the United Nations Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees. He's outgoing. He just left the office. And
I thought that was a comment on my character.
How many, we're always told in the news by people like me that this is the worst refugee crisis since World War II, that we are seeing really bad things go on. Can you give us kind of your perspective of what's happened there?
The UNHCR every year tallies up the number of refugees all around the world. This year it is the highest number it's been since World War II. 60 million displaced people, meaning people displaced over international borders. Those are refugees, and people displaced inside their country. About 20 million of the 60 million are refugees, and UNHCR watches over about 15 million of those people. 80% of the refugees in the world are taken care of by neighboring countries in the developing world. It's only 20% come to the developed. I think that's not appreciated, that most refugees simply flee over borders. And these countries are absorbing huge numbers of refugees. Lebanon is a country of 4 million people. It has taken in 1 million Syrian refugees. Jordan has taken in 700,000. Turkey, close to 2 million refugees. So these are very large numbers for countries that are absorbing these people and taking care of them with the help of donor states as well. But really, the bulk of the response has been in the neighboring countries.
Now, how do you find people to resettle with those kind of volumes of numbers? You can resettle who exactly? How many? Who do you pick?
Well, the first thing is it may be hard to believe this, but not every refugee wants to come to the United States or be resettled. The vast number want to go home, and they're hoping for peace in their home country and a rebuilding of their home country so that they can return home. Sorry?
Ben Carson was right.
I'm here as a UN official. I'm not going to make comments on American politics. So many want to stay in the region or close to the region and go home. A number do want to resettle, and particularly because this crisis has gone on now for 4 or 5 years and they've lived in difficult situations in these neighboring countries. Many are looking for a more stable existence, an end to their refugee status. UNHCR, there's a screening process and a selection process. So of the 14, 15 million refugees in the world, UNHCR identifies about 100,000 a year for resettlement. That's 1%, less than 1% for resettlement. People have to first meet the definition of refugee. They have to show that they have a well-founded fear of persecution if they're sent home. They then have to show that they don't come within any of the exclusion grounds for being here. They can't be a criminal. They can't have committed crimes against humanity or done other bad things that would disqualify them from refugee status. And then what UNHCR will do, will look among that population of people in that category who want to go elsewhere. They'll look for vulnerable refugees. And generally, UNHCR looks for orphans, for female-headed households, for other particularly vulnerable people, people with severe trauma or medical cases that need attention. So there's a huge screening. It's not as if everyone in the world is immediately identified.
And if you were a terrorist and really wanted to get in, you would have a really bad shot at it. I mean, 100 to 1 is not a good shot.
Well, no system is foolproof, but the screening process done in this country for refugees is the toughest screening process for any immigrant that wants to come into the country. And I think you'll hear people talk about the American process. But UNHCR, we do biometrics. We use iris scans now, very sophisticated technology to identify people, to make sure we know who we have, and we do the best screening that we can in identifying people to come in.
And we've heard a lot about the wait to get in the United States. Mm-hmm. Is that typical for other countries? Or other countries 2 years, 3 years?
It varies around the world. The United States seems to be at the far end of the time it takes to get in because of the many levels of screening, and I think it's not clear to us that the screening needs to be done. It's not clear why it takes so long, quite frankly. In many other countries, it's more expeditious. But just to contrast the American situation to the European situation in terms of the fears and concerns that have been expressed in the United States, the process I've just described is what UNHCR does. And the other night, as I said, you'll hear what the U.S. does, which is even more than what we've described. But in Europe, 1 million people arrived spontaneously. They weren't screened at all. Right? They marched, they walked, they came on their own, and they're still coming because of the fear from the home country as well as because of the uncertain conditions they're living in. Europe absorbed 1 million of these people. Now they'll adjudicate some and they'll find places where they should go. But the United States, through the refugee process, doesn't take spontaneous people like that. It only takes people who have been screened in the way that we have described. And for the 1 million taken by Europe, we're talking now only about 10,000 Syrian refugees. It's a tiny number compared to what the rest of the world's absorbed. And in fact, from UNHCR's perspective, we would hope that it would be far more generous.
Well, maybe we should shift over and go on to the national level here and talk with Bob Carey, who's director of the Office.
I answer to anything.
Office of Refugee Resettlement with Health and Human Services. Can you pick up kind of where we left off there with Alex, and what happens when when the UN comes to you with the people?
And fortunately, they don't come to me or my office, but the U.S. program is fairly complex, so I'll try to give the quick version and direct people to a couple of websites that can give you the intimate detail or suggest that they watch John Oliver on YouTube.
It's fun to watch all the little badges of the government agencies float by.
And I have to say that is one of the most succinct and accurate assessments that I've seen of the vetting process. So if you want a lighter version of it, I recommend John Oliver or the State Department website or the ORO website if you don't like John Oliver. But the vetting process after UNHCR's vetting process has been concluded, which, as Alex has referenced, is itself rigorous. The U.S. State Department administers the program, and refugees are referred to the State Department program overseas by UNHCR. They then go through the most rigorous screening process, both by State Department contractors and then by the Department of Homeland Security has specially trained cadres of staff members who are knowledgeable about country conditions. After they are vetted through those processes, there are at least 8 different databases that name biometric checks, face-to-face interviews of every individual who's coming to the U.S. So I could go on at incredible length, but as Alex has said, it is the most rigorous vetting program for any individuals who enter this country. And that's just the U.S. part of it. So once the very few who are admitted have been thoroughly screened and are determined under U.S. law to have a well-founded fear of persecution such that they cannot return to their country. And I think it's important to remember these are individuals who do not have options. They can't go back to their country of origin. They don't have legal status where they are. Resettlement is not an economically driven or a choice that's made because they want a better life. It's because they have been forced to flee their homes against their will, because often, as we've discussed today, they fear for the lives and the safety of their children, and they want to create a better life or really ensure the survival of their children and their family members. And the U.S. program has traditionally offered a life-saving opportunity for people to rebuild their lives, and that is part of the DNA of this country, and I think one of our proudest parts of our heritage is that we have been a country that has been founded on the principles of providing protection to people and an opportunity to people who are fleeing persecution. With regard to the office that I have the honor to head, we then, after the State Department initial placement has taken place, and the State Department handles the initial placement in consultation with voluntary agencies and states, ORR then takes on a role in consultation with states. And I'd like to point out, because there's a lot of misinformation out there about the program as a whole, Syrian refugees writ large, and what takes place before or during the time that individuals are going to a given state. But there is extensive community consultation that takes place both by the State Department, by the voluntary agency partners, and through the Office of Refugee Resettlement. There are quarterly consultations that are mandated by the Refugee Act, which is the legal authority under which the program operates. We convene calls with state refugee coordinators, who are individuals funded by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, but working under the individual state governments, often within the governor's office. And then there are community consultations that our voluntary agency partners convene on at least a quarterly basis. That's a requirement, and they have to demonstrate those, document them. They must demonstrate in writing each year that they have consulted with the schools, the police, all the municipal entities that might come into contact with refugees about the proposed number of refugees to enter the U.S., and then submit extensive documentation on that to the Department of State before they can be approved to resettle any individual in a given state. So I could spend, we could do a seminar on the consultation processes, but I think, in short, the administration is very much committed to working with governors, state governments, municipal governments, and all interested parties. The U.S. program is based on effective partnerships between federal and state actors and between the public and private sector. It's very much working through private nonprofit organizations, all of which contribute resources to the process. They bring volunteers to participate in the process. It's very much, it's not a model that other countries follow. There are great models that other countries have, but the U.S. is very much born out of the tradition of civic participation that is a core element of our national identity, I think, as well. So church groups, municipal groups, community groups all participate in the process, and I think bring a richness and talent and a warmth to the process of welcome that is unique and historically very successful.
Can you give us some idea about the numbers of refugees who are resettled typically in the United States? Because a lot of people might have noticed President Obama says, we're going to up it from 85,000 to 100,000.
Right.
And I don't think people have a sense of what's been happening over the past decade history in the past.
There were numbers historically, and I've been working in this field for longer than I'd care to admit, but there have been years when it has been as high as 200,000 or more during the Southeast Asian influxes, and years when it's been at 150. After 9/11, when new procedures were put in place, it dropped to about 30,000 for a year, and then it's been gradually, through Republican and Democratic administrations, moving back up towards a stated goal by both Republican and Democratic administrations of getting closer to what could be considered a 100,000 level norm. And an appropriate response by the U.S. to the level of international need. And I think it's important this is an area in which U.S. leadership has historically been critically important. Other countries do follow the U.S. lead. When the U.S. retracts its commitment to refugees or increases it, it does set an example. And it is part of a joint, there are meetings that UNHCR convenes annually, and countries make commitments in response to global refugee needs. And the U.S. response historically, the past couple of years, it's been in the area of 70,000, just under that for the fiscal year that just ended. Sorry, that was long-winded.
My impression of it is that the U.S. is a steady resettler and has good numbers, but like when there's a fluxy emergency, maybe not so much. I mean, Alex was talking, it seems like other developed countries kind of putting the pedal to the metal a little faster, a little better.
Our processes are not, do not change quickly, and decisions to admit refugees do not happen quickly for the U.S. There's a lot of process involved. These are considered decisions, some would argue more considered than they should be, given the humanitarian crises. But the Syrian refugee crisis has been going on for a number of years now, and and just under 1,600 individuals were admitted last year, and it's only up to about 2,000 now. So it has not been a rapid response. Other countries have been more rapid in the response. The status that the U.S. does offer when it offers refugee status is a permanent one. It's a considered status, but it allows people the opportunity to move towards permanent residence and ultimately citizenship. So it's
That's pretty good. Now
I'm new to this panel.
I think a lot of people wonder who decides who comes in. President Obama got to say, hey, we're going to have 10,000 Syrian refugees in the next year. That's our number. This is our thing. Is that what happens? The president sits down and says, we're going to take some Congolese this year. We're going to take the Burmese this year.
There's a more, that's a bit of it, but it's more complicated than that. It being the U.S. government and government generally, there is an annual consultation process between the administration and the government, and that the president, that is required under the law, that there be consultation between the leadership of our Congress. And that does take place. It took place this year, but it is consultation. It's not an approval and vetting process. Ultimately, it is the president who determines what the refugee admissions ceiling will be. That is an executive decision, and that decision is usually made at the beginning of the federal fiscal year on or around October 1st. So that is what happened this year, where the president consulted with Congress, and the administration decided that given the emergent refugee needs, that the ceiling should be increased to 85,000 this year.
I think the last time refugee or asylum news was so big, it was with the Iraqi interpreters and translators, many of whom still haven't gotten into the country.
Right.
And everyone was saying, "Hey, come on, let's go. Let's speed up the process. Let's speed up the process." And it never sped up. Is that the same thing that's going on?
Well, I wouldn't say it never. I mean, I was on the outside advocating with the government at that time on that very issue. So, and so I'd be the first to say that it didn't. But at this point, many Iraqi interpreters have been admitted, and many people whose lives were in jeopardy are living secure lives in the United States, and that was identified as a priority. There are some very significant logistical and security challenges to interviewing Iraqis inside Iraq, where many of them are, and then some of them have fled from the largest country housing Iraqi refugees was Syria. And unfortunately, some people have been forced to flee back into Iraq. The U.S. has regulations around the security situation that must be present in order for Department of Homeland Security officers to go in and interview in a given population, and that has been a challenge in Iraq because many of these individuals are still inside Iraq, and they're on a queue, and it's a great concern to the administration, and but it's something that has improved significantly. So,
I think people are seeing everything that's happened in the news, and Wonder, with all the governors who came out and suspended refugee resettlement, does the federal government have the authority to regulate this? Is there a binding obligation for the states to take refugees who have resettled?
The administration is very much committed to consulting with governors. I was on a call that was convened by the White House last week with governors, and a large number of them were on the call. And there has been extensive consultation subsequently, and the administration is continuing and will continue to work with governors. However, as part of this consultation process, every state has submitted a state plan to the Department of Health and Human Services, which details the services that will be provided to refugees in that state. And they have made a commitment that those services will be provided under U.S. law without regard to race, religion, or country of origin. So I think there's concern that the refugee program is a national program. It's administered at the federal level, and that is traditionally where the authority for admitting individuals to this country lies. So I think that's we are concerned that some states have expressed resistance to receiving refugees as they have traditionally been warmly received, but at the same time, a number of states have come out and reaffirmed their commitment, and a lot of communities and cities have reaffirmed their commitment to providing protection and reception to refugees. So.
Do any states have different deals with the federal government, or do they all get the same deal?
It's essentially the same program. There are some variations. There are a number of states, 7, I believe, that have elected not to administer the federal refugee program. And in those instances, they have voluntarily withdrawn, and the program is administered either by a county or by nonprofit entities on their behalf.
Oh, really?
So there are a number, but essentially it's the same program. It's just not administered by the state government. But the overwhelming majority of states, 42, 43, do administer the program, and they provide benefits as under federal law.
So the money for refugee resettlement, it goes generally from the federal government to the state government,
Yes.
except in those 7 instances.
Yes.
And then the state government has an obligation to pass it on to refugee resettlement agencies.
Yes, or in the instances of medical benefits, refugees are categorically eligible for a period of time for certain types of assistance that as anyone else who's legally present in the country would be. So refugees are eligible for 8 months of cash and medical assistance if they fit the criteria, or there's refugee cash assistance. So it's a very limited, time-limited form of assistance. Refugees in the U.S., unlike some other countries, don't have a very generous social service net, but many states do not either. But the benefit levels for refugees are tied to the state levels, and it's time-limited. So refugees are expected to go to work and go to work very quickly. And most of the funds that ORR administers through various state and NGO partners are focused on enabling them to go to work very, very quickly and become self-sufficient. But it's not a very generous, and it's an expedited process.
When President Obama says, well, we're going to have 20,000 more refugees next year, does that mean the budget that you're going to hand over is going to be 20% bigger? Because usually the money comes from Congress.
Well, we certainly hope so. But
is that the consultative part of it?
And there is a presidential budget request, but at this point, we and others in government don't necessarily have a budget. So I can't really speak to what the budget will be for this current year, but there is a proposed budget that would allow for provision of services to refugees and the other populations we serve, because with ORA we also serve asylees and special immigrant visa holders who are Iraqi and Afghan interpreters, and a couple of other torture survivors and some others.
All right, so Congress can have a say in this,
Absolutely.
With
Yes.
the purse strings at any given time.
And there are many oversight committees that have a role in any process, but certainly in both the admission of refugees and the services that are provided to them after they arrive.
All right, I think we're done with you, Bob. We're going to move on.
I'm assuming that's a good thing.
I think we're at a good point to move on to the state level and talk with Ngoan Lei, the Illinois State Refugee Coordinator with the Department of Health and Human Services. Thanks for joining us. And can you explain what happens on the state level, what the state of Illinois function is here?
Before I answer the question, I want to make sure I introduce my two colleagues who are in this room today. I have Patty Ngoan, also from Florida, and Charles Shipman from Arizona. So one thing I want to make sure you understand is that there are many programs where the federal government have the lead responsibility and the funding source that flow through the state, whether it's Medicaid, food stamp, so on and so forth. So in a way, you can look at the refugee program as one of those programs where it's the federal responsibility, and then the state is the one who administers those programs. So when we think about our relationship with our federal government, it's a combination of a partnership, a subcontractor, and then it's a relationship where we negotiate how the program should be implemented so that it fits the local unique nature of each state. As Bob just shared with all of you, the refugee program that is administered by ORR is designed to provide short-term support for refugees in their initial phase of resettlement in the state. And it's basically one of the points of tension between state and federal government, because the federal government may say, well, after 8 months or after 2 years of helping refugees, we think that's it. We should be able to walk away, and good luck to the states, and hopefully refugee will be integrated successfully. So as you can imagine, from the state perspective, we think of ourselves as wearing two hats. The first hat is to implement the federal program successfully. So if it's 8 months of assistance and we have to help refugees find jobs within the time frame, we do the best we can to achieve that goal. But we also wear the other hat, which is responsible for all Illinois residents. And we see refugees as our new Illinois residents, and we want them to be successful. So we have to look for what other needs they have, how do we make sure that they remain productive and happy in Illinois and become a contributing member for our state. So it's that tension between implementing a short-term federal program and our desire to make sure that refugees become productive Illinois or Arizona residents or Florida residents, that create a lot of tension between the states and the federal government, because we see that it's the federal government that have the right to decide how many refugees and what type of refugees come into our state. So we want that responsibility to stay until the refugees succeed, but the federal government, because of limited resource, draw a certain line. So we're always in the position of negotiating, what is the right program model, how much can be provided for refugees, and how much is expected from the state to make sure that refugees succeed.
How much is expected from the state? Does the state give a lot of money for refugee resettlement?
Each state operate differently, but in Illinois, for example, before the budget impasse, we actually have state money to support refugee mental health. There's Illinois College Fund that support English language class. And of course, the refugee children are enrolled in our public schools that are supported by local and state funding.
So a lot of the refugee resettlement agencies in the area, though, go out and try to raise their own money now to boost their resettlement power. They feel like they need more.
Right. I think as Bob mentioned earlier, because a lot of our social service program is always seen as a public-private partnership. You look at every nonprofit in our state, they all do fundraising. You all receive hundreds of invitations, I'm sure, throughout the year, or appeal for contribution, because both federal and state government a lot of time don't provide adequate support to do the work that needs to be done. So our private partners really do have to go the extra mile to raise the additional resources needed.
Have you ever seen a situation like this with Illinois now? Because you mentioned that you don't get to choose exactly who comes to the state, and I imagine it's some refugee communities are more challenging to resettle than others, and you maybe would like some kind of say or dialogue in this. Has there ever been anything like this situation with Syrian refugees being resettled?
I'm relatively new to the program, so I can't tell in the history of refugee resettlement if there has been a similar situation. I know that after 9/11, there was a pause because there were a lot of questions about whether or not we screen refugees and immigrants adequately. So this is maybe a second time that we're going through similar experience, but because it's targeting a specific group of people, then I think it's somewhat unusual. And again, this happens so recently. We understand that a lot of time the reaction after a crisis takes the proportion that is unusual for all of us to understand. But our governor, like many other governors, have been asking for a pause to really understand the security vetting process. But in the meanwhile, we continue to operate the program because there's still hundreds and thousands of refugees coming to our state. So we're not closing the door, we're not hitting a pause button whatsoever. We continue to do our work.
Well, what does that suspension mean then? What is when the governor says we're suspending the program? What is a suspension if there is no suspension?
It's a good question. I think the governor is very much in communication with the White House, with the State Department. So there seems to be a genuine interest in understanding what it would take to solve this position that the governor has taken. And I think those of us who are managing the program on a day-to-day basis, we understand that that part of the dialogue probably needs to continue until the governor believes that he's provided with the information he needs. But we have not been given any instruction to stop the refugee resettlement program.
I'd like to open this up and have everybody talk together about some of these issues. And is the U.S. resettlement program really, is it generous? I mean, people have been debating in Europe about, this program's generous and they're going to go there, it's an attraction. And we're seeing Canada open up a little quicker. They're going to have 25,000 Syrian refugees by March, they say, the new government there. And in the United States, refugee resettlement, they get a loan for their plane ticket, and eventually they have to pay that back.
Right. Yeah, I would say the program is fairly basic. in what it provides. And even with regard to what it currently provides, the funding has been flat for 10 years. So when you talk about the congressional role, there have been decisions made in the Congress with regard to the funding of this program that have kept the funding essentially level for 10 years. And while we serve 70,000 refugees, we are serving other individuals who come through a variety of legal mechanisms. So the populations that the office the ORR office serves have actually doubled during that period of time. There are 140,000 roughly we propose to serve in this year, and it's the same funding that was serving 70,000 people 10 years ago. So just as an indicator.
So we're half as generous as we were 10 years ago to the people who come.
I mean, if that's one way of, yes. And I mean, the assumption in the U.S. program is really very much focused on early self-sufficiency and going to work quickly. I think what we're trying to educate a lot of people about is the needs of the individuals we're serving in recent years in particular. Many of them are coming directly out of conflict zones. Many have experienced torture and trauma, have war-related injuries and other trauma. So the needs are significant, and I think it's important for us to at least educate people about what those needs are, that people come here and they have, we want them to become self-sufficient, but we also want to ensure that they have the tools to become self-sufficient.
Alex, how does a country like Canada do it? If are they more generous? Do they get the? Do they pop for the plane flight? Do they?
I mean, countries have different policies, but the United States takes more than half of all the resettled refugees in the world. So from the United States perspective, that's a generous program. I mean, you add up all the other resettling countries in the world, and it doesn't equal what the United States has taken historically and will hopefully take this year. The benefits may vary country by country. I think the one way the Canadians provide an interesting alternative, and I think this goes to the issues that both Bob and Juan raised about the resources, is they have a program of private sponsorship that was put in place with the Vietnamese boat flow, Vietnamese refugee crisis several decades ago. And different groups in Canada, private groups, are authorized to sponsor in refugees, and they take full responsibility for taking care of the refugees. They have an obligation for at least 1 year to sponsor them, so it doesn't come at cost to the government. And what that does is it allows Canada to dramatically increase the number of refugees it will take. So you mentioned that the new government in Canada has said they'll take 25,000 Syrian refugees over the next year or so. They expect they'll have an additional number of almost that many that private groups will sponsor, and even a group of 5 people can get together, or a church group or another organization. They will sponsor these people in. The Canadian authorities I've spoken to say they're getting now applications, about 200 a day are coming in to bring in Syrians. Now, assuming that the United States, the American people are as generous as the Canadian people, which I think is probably true, and assuming the United States is about 10 times the size of Canada, that might mean another, if a similar program were adopted in the United States, it might mean as many as 2,000 additional refugees a day, that if you take it over the course of, 200 a week, not 200 a day, 200 a week. So if you take it over the course of the year, it would be another 100. It would double the size of the refugee program if the United States were to think about a private sponsorship program. It would still have to go through the same vetting, et cetera, security screening, so you'd have to make sure that system can keep up with it. But I think it's a really interesting alternative that has worked well in Canada, and one that should be seriously thought about in the United States.
How do you know it's working well? Would you have to go check up? Because it seems like if every church and community group had, it seems like the refugees could have vastly different experiences.
Well, I mean, this is, I guess, part of Galia's research that she'll have to do here is to look at this. But it is a program that the Canadians have continued for several decades, and so obviously they think it's worked well enough to continue and now to expand dramatically. Can I go back to one other question you asked, Juan, about is there another time in American history where we've had this kind of backlash against refugees? And There is one sad example. It didn't take place at the state level, it took place at the federal level, and that was the treatment of Jewish refugees fleeing from Nazi Germany in the 30s and 40s. And it's really fairly well documented that the State Department was very slow in actually put obstacles in the way of refugees to get through the process. And the United States took far fewer refugees than it could have or should have. And we all know the famous story of the St. Louis, which was the boat that tried to land and was sent back. So there is a very sad experience when this country loses its generosity towards refugees.
How would you measure where that's at right now? Because if you look at the polls, they're not super supportive of refugee resettlement. If you just ask flat out about refugee resettlement, do you think the country is losing its generous spirit on this?
I don't. I mean, I think, and I think some of the people in this room could probably speak to it, because I heard stories when I was visiting providers yesterday in Chicago, that there, at the same time that there's been negative backlash, agencies that serve refugees have been overwhelmed with offers of support from volunteers and in-kind and cash support. And I think it's important to remember the U.S. program, unlike the Canadian, is a public-private partnership. Their Canadian has a public program and a private program, but and they also have a medical safety net that the U.S. does not. So I think a lot of the slack a lot of the shortages, if you will, in the U.S. program have been taken up by the private sector over the years when government funding has been flat. So there's an enormous private support that demonstrates the community engagement and support for refugees.
Jerome, I just want to mention that Pew did some research on American attitude toward different waves of refugees, and it consistently documented that whether it's Hungarian, Vietnamese, you name it, generally when you ask the public, will you welcome this group, the majority would say no. But the actual experience once the refugees are here is very different. My family, for example, was sponsored through the Catholic Charities, and a local Methodist church in Central Illinois brought us in. We live in the basement of this family for months before we can afford our own place when we find a job. So I think the actual experience is always very different than when you poll and you never know for sure exactly how the question is phrased. So if you gauge the public view versus the people who really are compassionate and care for refugees, it's a very different situation.
And I think that's an important point. In my work, I've noticed if you talk in abstract numbers, and if you talk about tens of thousands of people are very reactive when they don't understand a program, when they don't understand that it's controlled, that people are vetted. But if they meet the person who's in their community, Americans tend to be, in my experience, extremely generous. And when they hear the story of what they've experienced, they wonder why are they separated from their family? Why can't we do more? So I think there's a dissonance sometimes between what polls reflect and what communities reflect. And I think that's also an important time when leadership at the political level is important, when it's not driven by polls. And I think this administration's position on these issues have not been driven by polls, they've been driven by principles. And I think that's the way the program should be run.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that also our organization was overwhelmed with support from people that wanting to either sponsor a refugee or house a refugee, or they want to understand more about the refugee process. There's students here from Northwestern who want to meet a refugee family, but I've kind of been putting them off. I'm sorry. I see some of them here looking at me, so I know they've courted me now. But it's really been very overwhelming, to say the least, of the amount of support and generosity that we've received from people that we don't even know and want to support a family. So it's a good thing to have. It's a good problem to have.
You've got a waiting list.
Yes.
Some people want to help. But How do you explain the dissonance with the demagoguery? Because the demagoguery, if you look at all these what happened in Europe, all these parties that are anti-immigrant are making good headway in the elections. They're all the common thing, and it almost seems like our system is feeding off that, or there's almost a contagious effect of demagoguery against refugees, when at a point where we really have got to work towards solutions rather than do demagoguery.
The answer?
From the state perspective, when we look at the situation in Paris, what we're focusing on is the French citizens who are engaged in these activities. And you look at the integration model in France, we're very worried about the isolation, of some of the immigrant community. And I think that what we need to take away is, if we are going to welcome a new group of people to our country, what can we do to make sure that they then feel that this is their country and that they will be, a part of it, that they will contribute to it, and they will see their role in, being the next generation of leaders, and not feeling like they're not welcome, and therefore they have to find a place somewhere else that could be very detrimental to the place that welcomed them in the first place.
And Matt, I think the demagoguery and some of the public discourse is lamentable, and it's and I never thought I'd see it, and many of us didn't, and I don't think it represents the best things about our country. And but at the same time, this is an opportunity as well for people who do represent the best of our country, and some of whom are on this panel and in this room to speak. Everyone can be a spokesperson for a refugee program for these issues, and can educate themselves and educate the people around them and engage their community. And I think that's it's a time when it's important to do that, more so than any I've seen in recent years.
I want to make sure we have time for some questions. And we've got a couple of microphones, and people can run up and ask a question of anybody, and we will begin to tackle them one at a time. Man, you're really close to that microphone.
You were talking about a million crossing into Europe and settling. So America being the largest resettlement, how do you classify those who settle in European countries, for instance? So they're settling, they're not leaving necessarily, but they're obviously not going through the same kind of process. Right. So where do they sit versus ones that go through the official process?
Yeah, I was talking about really the difference between what I would call spontaneous arrivals and people who are selected overseas and brought in. So the million who have come to Europe came spontaneously. They didn't come through a formal selection process. The countries will then have to make a determination what kind of status they get, whether they will be welcomed and formally settled and given the kind of status that Bob described here. The American system is quite dramatic in terms of the people in 18 months can get a green card and then citizenship 5 years after that, or slightly less after that time, which is not true in all other countries that resettle refugees. So if you are selected by the United States overseas and brought in, you're on a really solid path to formal membership. The status of the people who brought themselves into Europe is yet to be determined by those countries, and the policies have varied in the various countries about how formal that status will be. The contrast I was trying to draw was that Europe has been able to absorb large numbers of people without the kind of screening that is anywhere close to what has been put in place here, and yet there still seems to be opposition to the 10,000 who would be put through that screening process and brought in.
Hi, my name is Mohammed, and I'm an Iraqi refugee myself. I'm here part of an organization called the Iraqi Mutual Aid Society, which was created to aid the Iraqi refugees, which we have 35,000 since 2003 until now in the U.S. And now we're receiving more Syrians, and we're working with Suzanne's community and network to have more to help more with the Syrian refugee influx as well. And we receive funding grants through ORR. So I think definitely the model that you were talking about, the partnership between the public and the private sectors in the U.S. is a great model that Europe and other places lack, and creates a vacuum where refugees fall without support. And one of the other things I wanted to mention is, for Iraqi refugees who went to Syria, a lot of us were displaced in 2011. And so Syrians were very welcoming of Iraqis when the war happened, and there were about 500,000 to 2 million, I believe, number. And then now it's the opposite, unfortunately, where Syrians are actually taking refuge in Iraq, which is very sad. But I have a question also for you guys. In an ideal world, what would be your solution for resettling refugees, and for the future, what are the changes that you would like to make in both the private and the public sectors, whether it's in the U.S. or through the UN and other channels?
Anybody want to take
Alex, you're obviously fond of the private.
I can speak on behalf of the Syrian refugees who are here. One of the, we did a survey with them, and we asked them, well, what are some of the things that you want, or what are some of the things that you need, or that we're not able to do for you? And their number one request was help with rent. When the refugees first come here, and they have 3 months of rent support. And some of the resettlement agencies who are more generous will help them an additional maybe few months, like Refugee One will help a few additional months for some of the families. But some others are left on their own. So 90 days to have to come to the US to learn a new language, to learn a new culture, to acclimate, to learn the transportation system. And then you have to have a job, and the job is probably like at minimum wage, and you have to pay your rent right away after 90 days. It's really overwhelming and daunting for them. So I wish that there was more support in terms of rent instead of 90 days, maybe 6 months at least, or so that's like for the refugees that we're working with. This is their number one concern. They don't want to go to programs because they keep saying, well, we can't pay rent. How can I go to this program? Every time we try to push them to do anything extra so that they can improve on and increase improve on their skills, they tell us, well, our number one concern is rent. I'm not going to go to this unless I have money for rent, and unless I can take care of my basic needs. So this is like the number one issue for them is rent support. I wish the funding would be there so that they can have more time just to adjust and to acclimate.
Well, Bob, when is there a strategy to counter that? Is there? I've heard that a lot of times refugees are settled in medium-sized cities because it's cheaper to live, and the rent is easier, the ability to acclimate's a little more casual, and going to Chicago or New York isn't the best thing to do necessarily.
Well, I think they're very individual choices. I mean, one, you can't resettle everyone in this. I go across the country, I hear housing is a problem. Finding affordable housing is difficult for Americans. It's very difficult for refugees, and I think there are benefits and challenges to each city. Chicago has a good public transportation system. There are employment opportunities that may not be available in a small community in social services, and in social, each community has its benefits and challenges. So. And I think an effort is made by voluntary agencies working with the State Department to place refugees where they're going to have the best chances of success across the country, recognizing that you can't overly affect any one community because you'd overwhelm the services. I think within the hierarchy of needs, housing is significant. Psychosocial services for the populations we're seeing now are significant. The need for, the absence of, I think school impact grants we provide, but they're really not adequate. So I think assistance for children in adjusting to school and support for those efforts, and for youth. And then I would also say professional recertification is a big challenge. And there are a whole host of other areas I could go into, some of which are funds, but which the funding is not really commensurate with the need.
How does that work out on the state level? I know that Rockford is a nice medium-sized city that is shrinking and wants people, and I know a large number of Burmese refugees resettled in Rockford, but the unemployment rate in Rockford seems to be double what it is in Chicago or something like that. How does that play out for you guys?
Yeah, I want to explain that there are two drivers to where refugees ended up resettling. The first is the model used by the U.S. is to work, State Department working with 9 national resettlement agencies. Each one of them have a set of local chapters. So where the chapters are, and if the chapters are interested in doing resettlement, then that becomes a resettlement site. So that's one driver. The other one is the family reunification priority. So if a refugee already have family members in Chicago, then most likely that next set of parents or children would be resettled in Chicago as well. I know in the early days of Southeast Asian refugee resettlement, there was a much more intentional effort to disperse the refugee to many communities so that no community would experience greater impact, potentially creating burden on the social service system. But I think the refugee program has really become a very well established program, and the presence of many of the agencies that are with well-trained staff with long years of experience in resettling refugees, they become the continued pipeline for where refugees come.
Thank you. And our ORR grant was actually for educational and employment assistance. But like Susan said, it's a lot of refugees always say, well, I can't put food on the table, so how am I supposed to work on my resume? And people think it's great to imagine the American dream coming here, really working hard and making it, but if you bring a British engineer and tell them to build their resume for an American engineering company, it would take them months to build them for their resume and finally get an interview and finally get hired. And less, a Syrian or an Iraqi who has been through conflict and trying to build their resume back and get a decent job. But thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you for Northwestern as well. And if any students are interested in internships, we're more than happy to have you guys. I'm sure Susan would be too, because she said a lot of you are interested. And we always look for English teachers or resume assistants and things like that. Thank you.
My name is Ifrah Magan, and I am Somali American, but my family moved from Somalia and then lived in Egypt for about 10 years prior to moving to the United States as refugees. About 16 years ago, I would not be able to stand up here and speak to y'all in English, yet alone I could have barely say hello and goodbye in English. And today, I'm very thankful and fortunate to do this work as a doctoral student, researching resettlement and integration of Somali refugees here in Chicago. And thank you. And I'm very, for all of you who are interested in migration, but for those of you who don't understand this process or who are here to find out more about who refugees are and what is the process of becoming a refugee in the U.S., that, there's always the politics that's involved with the label of being a refugee. But I loved what Suzanne said about, that smile that could really, contribute so much more. And being welcoming and just showing this, our humanity. I think that's what's really lacking here in our current public discourse, unfortunately, here in the United States. But the U.S. has been very generous of accepting refugees. I think we do have, the largest refugee population in capitalist nations. Suzanne and I we had this amazing trip through the State Department to look at refugee integration work in Sweden. And one of the things that we were really taken back by was the existing refugee and immigrant communities in Gothenburg, the city that we were in. There was no sort of an established existing immigrant refugee population that sort of took on this path of becoming Swedish, where here in the United States, I feel that, you know, specifically with the Syrian American community, the Syrian diaspora has really taken a big part in this process of resettling refugees, but more so on an international level. The humanitarian work of people like Dr. Sahloul and others in other states. I would love for you, Suzanne, to talk more about, you know, that push from the Syrian diaspora here, and kind of speak to also this, again, our current discourse of anti-refugee but anti-Muslim. There's Islamophobia here present in our country. Unfortunately, most people, you know, will listen to the media and see whatever, you know, the way that Muslims are portrayed and think that, you know, Muslim equals non-American, but there are Muslim Syrian American doctors and service workers and people who are very much part of, you know, this larger discourse. And so I would love for you if you could just sort of explain some of the work of other Syrian communities that you've partnered with, whether it's in Michigan or elsewhere in the States, and just kind of talk about that work that you've done as a Syrian American.
Thank you, Akhras. The Syrian American community really stepped up after the crisis started in 2011. Prior to 2011, there were only one or two Syrian American organizations. SAMS was one of them, and there was another political advocacy group also in Washington, D.C. But then after the crisis, the joke is by the time the crisis will end, every Syrian will have their own NGO. So that's how, you know, there's over like 25 Syrian American NGOs doing international work, whether it's with refugees or orphans or schools, and now with the refugee resettlement coming here on a domestic level. So the Syrian American community has spent millions of dollars sending aid overseas, and hundreds of millions of dollars, I would say. And there's so many groups that have started schools and have started all kinds of initiatives in Turkey and in Jordan and in Lebanon. Just SAMS by itself. I mean, of course, I will always speak. I'm biased. I will always speak about SAMS as the first organization because I was involved in. Has offices in Turkey, 2 offices in Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon. They do psychosocial work. They do help with refugee aid, anything that the refugees will need, counseling, and then here, obviously, a lot of the advocacy work that's being done. We partner with SAMS because they have great relationships with you know, all of the NGOs in Washington D.C. and with other groups. And there's many groups in Michigan also that are coming up and working in terms of advocacy and changing the narrative of, you know, unfortunately in the last year that the Syrian crisis took on the narrative of ISIS, that we've forgotten that it's people who are suffering, it's the people who are experiencing the trauma, it's women and children who are being displaced and who are being killed, and it's really that, you know, I don't want to turn it into a political conversation at all, but it's the Assad regime that's been killing the people before ISIS came along, and ISIS came as a result of the vacuum that we've left in place. But again, I don't want to turn political, but it's the Syrian community just really stepped up in terms of its advocacy efforts and trying to change the narrative and keep the narrative with the people, the civilians, that have been really the victims of all of this, and it's not really ISIS, and you know, so we're, you know, trying to put a human face to everything that's with everything that's been happening. And for us, as a small organization, we need those larger organizations to partner with, so that we can also work on advocacy efforts, especially with all of the rhetoric that's been coming out against refugees here in the U.S. You know, there's part of it is the Islamophobia and the anti-immigrant and anti-refugee rhetoric that's feeding into all of this together. It's intertwined together. So for when Donald Trump comes up and says, well, if Syrian refugees come here, we're going to send them all back, you know, so we have to do something about this, about what he's saying, and all of us, I think, collectively can do that. And it's more powerful for someone that's non-Syrian to come out and speak against this rhetoric than it is from a Syrian American, because of course I'm going to say this is wrong, but when everybody else joins our advocacy efforts and will speak to this, it's more powerful, especially with faith groups, that will be really translated into action.
I have a question regarding a targeted group of people that are now refugees, namely the Christians in the Middle East. I am an Assyrian. I'm not a refugee. I've left a long time ago. However, you mentioned the Jews during Second World War. There were many other nationalities and races that were affected by the war, but the Jews were targeted from within all that trouble during the war. Same thing is happening in the Middle East. The Christians are a targeted group. And not getting into politics, however, refugees are as a result of politics. So how do you have some sort of a safeguard for that small minority group that has been indigenous in those countries that are being shuttled around from Iraq to Syria, back to Iraq, and they have no option. They're feared for their life, and also they're being targeted and killed for the simple reason of being Christian. And the atrocities that are happening, we're sort of grouping them as, well, they're all refugees. No, they are refugees, and I'm not saying that we cannot help everyone, but is there a specific urgency or emergency to help those specific refugees that are being targeted?
Well, the refugee definition, I'm going to get lawyerly about this, says someone who's persecuted based on race, religion, national origin, membership in a social group, or a political opinion. Did I say that twice? Anyway. So people targeted based on their religion qualify for refugee status. So any person who belongs to a targeted Christian group who flees outside their country would be given refugee status and entitled to all the rights and benefits that refugees get. And would be open for resettlement and as a refugee. So they would be protected under international refugee law.
But would they be given preferences?
Under the
like the Jews were, in some situation, and I'm sorry that they were also sent back.
The Convention on the Status of Refugees prohibits discrimination based on religion. So UNHCR would not support programs that favor one religious group over another group for resettlement or for other kinds of treatment. However, since UNHCR focuses on the most vulnerable refugees, if a particular group were among the most vulnerable, they would then be thought carefully about in terms of resettlement and other kinds of protection. But it can't be done simply under the convention. It can't be done simply on the basis. Religion can be the basis for being targeted on your religion, can be the basis for being a refugee. But then in undertaking refugee relief, religion cannot be a reason to distinguish people, except to the extent it may play into their overall vulnerability. Is that helpful?
Well, are certain countries more susceptible to helping these particularly targeted groups? Is there?
Yeah, I mean there may be affinities between countries for all sorts of grounds, and it's up to each country to make its determination of the refugees it wants to bring in. So and the United States, in fact, has brought in religious groups in its refugee program. It's identified particular religious groups over the last 20, 30, 40 years that have been particularly targeted. You can say more about that, Bob.
Can they apply as a religious group?
Yes.
Well, they would apply as a refugee, but part of their claim would be based on persecution on the basis of their religion. As
I'm saying more than that, Bob. In the president's designation, where he designates groups, there have been religious groups that have been designated for special treatment.
So,
under the U.S.
are the Hmong an example of that? The Hmong in Cambodia, or is that?
Well, they're designated nationalities, and they're the Hmong, so there are regional designations and then nationality designations for refugee status. But then within that, and I think we may get deep into the law here, and there are people who are more expert in that than I am, but with regard to, for instance, within the Iraqi population, there was a fairly high percentage of religious minorities who were identified and approved for admission to the U.S. Part of their claim for coming to the U.S. was their persecution on the basis of their religious beliefs. Also LGBT refugees, because they're a social group. So, victims of gender-based violence. There are, within the U.S. definition, and what would be part of the claim that they would make for admission to the U.S. would be the persecution on one of those designated grounds.
I wanted to talk about other ways that citizens or youth such as myself could get involved with helping integration with these refugees.
That's a good question.
Well, at the local level, we do have some agencies that work with refugee resettlement on a daily basis. And I know they welcome volunteers to tutor English, to help the children with their homework assignment. And there are just so many things that any individual who's interested in helping refugees could do. So if you want a list of agencies in this area, I'd be glad to get that sent to you.
There are several in this room. The Kovler Center helps with torture survivors. The Pan-Africa Association helps with Refugee One is right next to the Pan-African Association. The Heartland Alliance is here.
So you'll be right. You'll be sorry that you make that offer because
they're going to arm wrestle
They're going to be
over
mobbing
here.
after they...
Raise awareness in your school. Invite speakers to come and share the stories of the refugees, and that's how you can change the point of views of your classmates and change their hearts.
Yeah, that's a great way to do it, and have some folks in the school. Galia, you want to take that?
Yeah, thank you. Before we conclude, first of all, I think, again, it was a great example of education. One of our speakers had pointed out, unfortunately incorrectly, the Jews were not saved. That was the point of part of the story of the St. Louis. And we're afraid that we would repeat that mistake. So similarly, Jews were viewed with suspicion. They were viewed as being perhaps collaborators in the Holocaust, and they were left to perish, and they were turned away and shipped back. And we don't want that to happen with the Syrians. So I think the lesson is, it is very hard to get the message through. And so we have to keep at it. And I want to just say that I'm listening to the panel to emphasize that this is really a celebration here tonight also of the launch of the research program for refugee resettlement. We're in fact starting off with our first study. We're beginning our field research, Jessica Darrow and I, in January, and we're looking at the resettled refugee integration experiences and outcomes 1, 5, and 10 years out in 6 different states. We hope to have that study available by the fall. We're also doing a discourse analysis of the public perception of refugees, which is another important study. Today we had, like I said, a forum where a whole host of other questions came out, and there's many other researchers in this room who are doing other studies on secondary migration. We hope to collaborate to study, as Alex said, the differences between the Canadian privatized model. And we have, hopefully still in the room, a Canadian. Is Chris still here? He's back there. You can all maul him during the reception and ask him about the Canadian program. So there's many questions, and we look forward, to doing the research on that and collaborating with our colleagues at other universities and institutions here in the United States and overseas to be able to really bring this information out through data gathering and evidence-based research so we can have better informed policy. And I want to invite you all to a reception after this to celebrate that. But right now, I think we should applaud our phenomenal panel.